fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back. And now joining us for the interview, we have the author of American Sherlock. It's Murder Forensics and the Birth of the American CSI. We got Kate Winkler Dawson. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Kate, how did you get into this subject, and enough to write the book?
Well, it was interesting. So, my first book was called Death in the Air, and it was about an event. So, it was the 1952 smog in London that killed 12,000 people. And within that event, you find out more about the smog through these real-life characters. So there's a little girl, there's a cop, there's a doctor, and a serial killer, because I write true crime. So for the second book, I knew I wanted to do sort of the reverse. I wanted a bunch of different events told through the eyes of one person. And I knew I wanted to do forensics, and I was kind of on the hunt for a good forensic scientist who had made history and, was an interesting character. And so I just bought a book. I bought a book on essentially the Encyclopedia of Criminals, which is very thick, not surprising, in America. And I started reading. It was I started with the Pilgrims, and I made it into the poisoners of the 1800s and the mobsters of the 1920s. And at 1923, there was this great story about a botched train robbery that happened in Oregon. And the cops were befuddled, 4 people dead, 3 robbers on the run, nobody could give an identification. And the federal agents that came in were given a pair of overalls were really the only real big clue. And the only thing they could find on the overalls was a bit of mechanic's grease. And, they were just clueless. And so the sheriff was nervous, and he called Oscar Heinrich, who's the subject of the book. And he was a forensic scientist who worked in Berkeley, California from about 1910 until he died in 1953. And they handed him the overalls, and when he returned the results, he had found somewhere between 20 and 30 different clues from trace evidence just on that pair of overalls. One clue that pointed directly to one of the robbers, so they could actually trace this person, and the rest were, a profile. He could say how much the person weighed, how tall he was, the color of hair, his habits. And so, of course, when I read that and I saw his moniker, which was America's Sherlock Holmes, that I just kind of figured that's book number 2 for me.
Now, what did you find about Oscar Heinrich? Were you surprised that he was able to do so much way back then?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was interesting about him that we don't have now is I would call him a generalist. So he was someone who knew 20 to 30 different disciplines within forensics, and they didn't even call it forensics then. So he understood botany, geology, entomology, bugs. He understood ballistics, bloodstain pattern analysis. And some of these things he was professionally trained in, and some of these things he just picked up either from other experts or from reading. And so he was able to walk in to a crime scene and look, kind of scan the room, and think about the 10 to 15 different tests that he could run on this one crime scene. And that's really different than now. Now everybody's siloed, generally. At a crime lab, you have a DNA expert, you have a fingerprint expert, You have a bloodstain pattern analysis expert, and it should be like that. You should have people who are specifically trained in their own expertise. But Oscar was so unique because he would go to a crime scene, which forensic scientists don't do now. He would collect his own evidence, and then he would return to a lab. So, this is the beginning of forensics, really, in the United States. I mean, it's just emerging. There are now, he was the first professional witness to take the stand ever, which means he was professionally trained. He was a chemist. He was a sanitary engineer. He was a chemical engineer. So he was really more qualified than just about anyone else to testify in most of these cases.
How was it back then? But during the train heist, for instance, and he comes up with these pieces of evidence. Was it taken seriously, or what did people just kind of, think of it as kind of hokey?
Well, at the beginning, he got the most kickback, certainly from police officers who thought he was Bigfooting their investigations. Often he would come in at the very beginning of his career. He would often come into an investigation, several weeks into it. Once the cops had been stumped, then they would spend the money, or the prosecutor would spend the money, and he would come in. So, you have cops who haven't been able to solve a case, and now they're seeing someone come in who, is supposedly an expert and smarter than they are. And, Heinrich he didn't like cops that much. There were certain cops who he did like, but he really liked the educated police officers. He felt like the police officers in this time period, really in the 1920s, leaned too heavily on intimidation, on the third degree, spraying suspects with water hoses. They leaned on hunches, and he just didn't believe in all that. Even though he did work off his own hunches, he really was working in the time period that was the Wild West of forensics. Anyone could be an expert. The cops were doing guesswork, and they were using unreliable types of forensics to try to solve the cases.
So now, in this book, I think you've got 10 different cases or something like that here. How did you choose which ones you were going to write about?
Well, it's interesting. So the story behind that is when I first found out when I first kind of sorted out that Oscar should be my second book, I looked to see if he had an archive, if he had a collection somewhere. And he did at UC Berkeley, which was fantastic. It was huge, more than 100 boxes. Again, fantastic for an author. But it was closed because it was so big. And so, I had to petition UC Berkeley and figure out how to frame it so that I could convince the archivist that he was worth spending time on archiving. And so I finally convinced her. And when we started digging into the cases, she said, listen, it's going to be about a year and a half before you're going to be able to get into his case files. And you can have 2,000 of his letters. You can start reading up on his correspondence. But you can't have any of his cases because I have to catalog them all. And so I said, okay. And I said, what are his 15 thickest files? And so she looked. She spent a week looking, and she came back with a list and just said, here are his 15 biggest cases, which sounds sort of silly and arbitrary, but, when you're an author, you want as much material as possible. I want trial transcripts. I want his journals. I want his notes. I want evidence that he kept, and all of that was there. And so the thicker the file, I figured, the more important the case. And so she gave me this list, and I sort of narrowed it down based on the type of forensics that he used. So I tried not to repeat. So if you look at each chapter, at the top there's a Sherlock Holmes quote because of his nickname, America's Sherlock Holmes. So there's a Sherlock Holmes quote that's connected to the type of forensics that's actually used in that chapter. So I have a chapter that really the primary forensics he used was geology. Another one was entomology with bugs. Another one was bloodstain pattern analysis. The Fatty Arbuckle case, which was a silent film star who won a trial for manslaughter, that was a fingerprinting case. And so I sort of just narrowed it down from there. And while she cataloged those cases in Berkeley, I was in Austin doing my own independent research away from Oscar's collection. So, the Fatty Arbuckle case, for instance, the silent film star, it's pretty well documented. A couple of books have been written about it. The trial transcripts are available. I was able to do my own research and actually start building the book without having access to his files. I didn't have access to, his case files, his notes, his journals until probably 9 months before the book was due. So I had to fill in a lot of blanks.
So where did Berkeley get this collection from, this massive collection? Who was keeping it for all those years?
Well, so he died in 1953, and he had a wife and 2 sons. And Oscar had an office in San Francisco that he had to close. We can get into his financial issues later. He had a lot of financial issues. So he had to close this office. Everything was in his Berkeley lab by the time he died. And it was at the bottom of his house in the basement. And it was a huge lab, and he kept everything. He was like, I joke, he was like a productive hoarder. He kept everything that really mattered, but it was such a tremendous amount of stuff because he was such a meticulous investigator that it was overwhelming. So he died, and then I think the house stayed within the family, and they just never, I think they probably just locked the door and never touched the stuff. But in 1965, his youngest son, I kind of joke, I don't know if this is true or not, but I rented whatever U-Haul was available, if there was a U-Haul back then, and dumped it on the steps of UC Berkeley because they just put everything in boxes, and it had never been opened. I think Berkeley just saw it was huge and unwieldy, and they were understaffed like a lot of archives are, and so they just put it in their storage, where it has been for 60 years essentially. And the reason I know none of the boxes were really opened was when Lara Michaels, who is the archivist at Berkeley, started opening the boxes. They found 2 or 3 loaded pistols from one of his cases.
Oh, wow.
And they had, loaded, like they had bullets. So they had to call UC Berkeley police to have the firing pins removed. So that's a dream collection for me, obviously. And when I sat next to the archivist, when she finally invited me to come to Berkeley, I went to the warehouse. I didn't go to the library. So if any of your listeners have done research, you go to a library, you get patted down almost. They want to make sure you're not bringing any weapons, you're not taking anything out. You have to register. You give them a little slip. They give you 1 box at a time. It's very orderly. And the archivist said, you're not going to be able to get this book done if you don't just come to the warehouse. And so I went to the warehouse, and there were all of his boxes just laying there. And she said, just go pick out whichever one you want. She was literally assigning numbers and folder numbers to the boxes while I was looking through them. And so it was such a surreal experience because, I picked up a locket of hair, and I said, Laura, what hair is this? Where's this from? And she said, oh, that's from the Fatty Arbuckle case. So Fatty Arbuckle, the silent film star, was on trial for killing a woman, an actress named Virginia Rapay. And then she said, that's Virginia Rapay's hair. So he shouldn't have had any of this stuff, none of the guns. He had bomb parts. I mean, he had I had a jaw bone. There was a skull, a cracked skull. There was he took a bullet out of a dead person's heart and filled the hole in the heart with wax. For some reason, I don't but it was labeled like that. And so I picked this up, and here's this little wax figure. It was such an odd, interesting. It was great. It was wonderful for me.
Well, I guess back in that time, he wasn't under any sort of regulation, was he?
No, nothing. And honestly, people ask me about his legacy, and I think he had a lot of different legacies. He was a professor at UC Berkeley for 30 to 40 years. He started the first criminology courses there. So, I'm a professor at the University of Texas. So, of course, I think that's his legacy. He taught thousands of people in his lifetime how to use forensics correctly. But really what he did that was so amazing was he came up with a very organized, meticulous way to collect evidence and then catalog it at a crime scene. And no one had really done that before. So because he was, I am quite sure, obsessive-compulsive, he came up with his own system. So he had certain labels. He had ordered a particular type of containers. He measured everything. I looked through his notes at the Fatty Arbuckle case, which happened in 2 or 3 different suites at the St. Francis Hotel. It was a huge party, and he, no joke, had like 6 to 10 pages of measurements of probably completely innocuous evidence, hair, feather that he found. I mean, just like what I looked at and just went, God, how long did he do this? He was on his hands and knees measuring, and then he would put like longitude and latitude in different positions in the room. So it was madness. I mean, but he cataloged this stuff so he could find it immediately later when he went to trial. And so it was brilliant, and it's a technique that really set a blueprint for all of the contemporaries, who he worked with, and it really affected forensics and how meticulous and, how detailed investigators are now.
Did he actually do his work for a particular, like for the prosecution, or, if they had someone they suspected, was he kind of hired to figure out if that person did it, or did he just sort of check just for the truth? Like, what was his initiative?
Well, much of the time he was hired by the prosecutor, because when he would be hired, like I said, he would be coming into a case sometimes 1 or 2 weeks behind because they were stumped. And so he might be hired by the police officers to just figure out who a suspect is, not to have him prosecuted. A lot of times he was hired by prosecutors to eliminate suspects. He would occasionally be hired by defense attorneys, but the sort of the big case in my book is the case of David Lamson, who was a executive at Stanford University Press in Palo Alto. His wife ended up dead in the bathroom. He was arrested. The prosecutor accused him of beating her to death with an iron pipe. And Heinrich was hired by the prosecutor to prove this using bloodstain pattern analysis. So he walked into the bathroom. He did his little measurements with his, cardboard dial using trigonometry, and he walked out and immediately resigned from the case and called the defense attorney because he said, this guy didn't do it. That's not what happened here. So, I think those switcheroos were rare, but he would never compromise his integrity on the stand. What he did do, which was problematic, was he would let his own biases, number one, his own biases seep in, like in the case of Fatty Arbuckle. He really disliked Hollywood. He disliked actors. He thought they were unseemly, and he really thought like they were dragging everybody, into hell, essentially. And so, you can really see in that chapter his bias against Fatty Arbuckle, the actor. And, Oscar was relying on forensics that has since been debunked. And they didn't know it back then. I mean, they just thought this is a new technique. Fingerprinting, that yes, I can see this fingerprint looks just like this fingerprint. Ergo, this is our suspect is actually the killer. But that's not the case now, and we know that. So, he had some hubris there that was problematic that still experts today have, where they aren't able to admit that, their methods need to be tested more thoroughly.
Right. It's almost gone too far.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that what happens with juries is they see a couple of things. Either they see an expert in a white coat, or in Heinrich, he loved tweed suits. He would wear a tweed suit. He always looked like a professor, and they would believe him. Or Heinrich really, really had a problem figuring out the right vernacular to use with an audience, like a group of jurors who maybe didn't even have a high school education, let alone a college education. So he struggled with scientific vernacular and confusing a jury, and that happens now too. You know, you have one expert on one side contradicting seemingly the same expert on the other side. Well, who's the jury going to believe? I mean, who, you know, the one who looks better, or who sounds better? It's confusing. And so it's still a very complicated process for jurors and judges now.
Mm. So now, of these cases, is there one that really kind of sticks with you even today?
Yeah, I think that the David Lamson case is really interesting because, I'm sorry, I tend to spoil all my stories. I'm going to try not to spoil this too much. But the David Lamson case is really confusing for me because, you know, here is this seemingly happy couple. He has really no criminal. He has a criminal record, sort of, but not really. He accidentally killed a boy when he was younger in a hunting accident. But he's got a spotless record. And so when she ends up dead in the bathroom and there's blood on every wall, it's really difficult to believe that someone like David Lamson, who is this upstanding citizen and you know, seemingly a really good husband, would do it. And of course, I'm not naive enough to say that husbands don't do that. Of course they do, and seemingly perfect husbands do that also. But I think that case was interesting because Heinrich believed she either slipped and fell and hit her head. The prosecutor believed David Lamson got really mad and beat her to death. And there was this third option that I was talking to a neurologist that he and I both came up with that was interesting. And the third option could have been because the reason that Heinrich and ultimately some jurors believed that Aileen Lamson died by slipping and falling was the pattern on the back of her head was perfectly evenly spaced, as if a bathroom sink, as if her head hit a bathroom sink, and the ridges were perfectly spaced, and they measured up to the bathroom sink, right? So nobody's going to hit someone with a pipe evenly spaced as she's falling down. It just didn't make, the wound pattern didn't make sense, and his motive didn't make sense. But what haunts me about that case is what the neurologist and I came up with, which is, okay, well, what if David Lamson, threw her into the sink? What if he grabbed her and threw her in? That would account for, you know, the markings on her head, and, you know, also, you know, it would account for, you know, Heinrich had these measurements that showed where she was falling at the time. So we just won't ever know. I mean, David Lamson, that case was so confusing, and it went all the way to the California State Supreme Court. And, you know, what you essentially had was juries and even Supreme Court justices pretending to fall and hit their heads to figure out whether or not this woman could have died that way. So, you know, it was one of the more interesting cases that I think he had.
No, I guess true crime took a big, was really popular in the 20s, sort of like how it is now. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think it's probably the same thing. I liken true crime, for me, to the people who are fanatics about sci-fi. You know, if you think about it, compelling characters usually, right? Where people are not used to being in, and hopefully, you know, I will never be involved in a true crime story. Hopefully, you know, I'll never know somebody who's capable of doing that. It's just a world that you're dropped into that we're not used to, and it feels far removed. So somebody asked me the other day, it was an interesting question, about families. Like, have I ever, you know, do I encounter families who don't appreciate true crime stories. And because, maybe they were involved in one, like, a loved one was murdered. And I had to really think about that, because I think that's the reason why I like old true crime. I don't like involving current families who I can talk to and get reaction from. I did that as a TV news producer for years, and I just did not like knocking on someone's door and dredging up the past. And so the stories that I do, the first book was from 1952. This one is primarily in the 1920s. A book that I'm probably going to do now is late 1800s. I think I'm going older and older. I keep going backwards because I think I need some arm's length. I need space, because it's, with the first book I did, Death in the Air, there's a little girl in it who loses her father because he has to walk through the smog. She's 78 years old now, and I interviewed her extensively, and it was still painful for her. And it's been 60 years. And so I think that must play into it a little bit. And I think that now is a reason why, people, and particularly women, are incredibly drawn to true crime. Like, incredibly drawn. It is by far the largest audience is women for true crime. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think, women like tips. I don't know if it's to stay away from serial killers, but we like to armchair quarterback a little bit. We like to kind of see where other people went wrong, not in a morbid way, but just in a cautionary way, I guess. So I think there's a whole host of reasons. There also could be, for all Americans, a little bit of a better them than me kind of thing, as bad as that sounds, So I think there are a lot of reasons why people like true crime. It's a good story. I mean, it's just you've got the narrative arc. You've got good people, bad people. Someone changes after it. No matter what, someone is altered by the end of the story. And that is the best kind of story.
Yeah. Now, so what can you tell us about his personal life and how he lived outside of his work?
Well, so, he was married and he had 2 children. And Oscar was really interesting, thank goodness, because, I've looked into doing books about not so interesting people, and it's just so boring. You really want somebody with a lot of detail, and, Oscar was really angst-ridden, which, as a friend would be difficult for me, to deal with if I were his friend, but as an author who's doing his biography, it was really interesting. So he lost his father at a very young age, very tragically, and from that time he had an incredible paranoia, much of it warranted, over finances. And his father's death left him and his 2 sisters and his mother almost destitute. He was forced to drop out of high school. And what's interesting is I think he might not have become a forensic scientist had his father not died, because he dropped out of high school and he started working at a pharmacy as kind of a cleanup boy. And the other pharmacists encouraged him, when he was 18, to go ahead and read books and study and take the state exams in Tacoma, Washington, to become a pharmacist. And so he couldn't afford a proper education, no pharmacy classes, but he read and he did it, he passed, and he got a great job as a pharmacist, and that was the beginning. He learned toxicology. He learned about drugs, about medicinal whiskey. He learned about handwriting analysis, because he had to constantly interpret the horrible handwriting of doctors. And he learned about human nature, right? I mean, he had people coming there to the pharmacy begging for drugs that they weren't prescribed to use. And so this gave him an immediate education, essentially in forensics. And so I think that set him off on a really great career path. However, this constant fear of bankruptcy, which almost happened to him 3 times. The bank almost foreclosed on his house because he was not a money manager, not a good money manager. His reaction was so interesting, which was, I called him a hoarder of productive information. So, he hoarded everything with his cases, all of his evidence. But he also hoarded financial information. And that was what was so interesting. So I found just stacks of 40 years worth of daily logs of everything he spent every day, 5 cents for bread, 20 cents for gas, or whatever. And he logged it. Can you imagine the amount of effort that must take for somebody who's juggling 20 to 30 cases a month? And he journaled everything. So in his private journals, he wrote down what time he talked to people. The case that he talked about always went in the margin, thank goodness. He talked about, when he would wake up, when he would smoke a pipe, when he took lunch, when he went to bed. He journaled when he was journaling. He wrote 8 to 9 p.m. journalizing. So he really was OCPD for sure. And I think that was so interesting. And a friend of mine said, do you think that he became like this kind of OCPD guy, because he knew to be a forensic scientist, he was going to have to, pull together all this information and be able to recall things, kind of like have a Sherlock mind palace. And I said, no, I think it's the other way around. I think he became a forensic scientist because of this personality disorder. I think he needed to be able to control things, to catalog things, to put things in order. He loved minutia. He loved red tape. So he just, and I can relate to all of that. So as soon as I saw his collection, I went, oh, I know exactly what's with this guy for sure. So it was so much fun digging through it. It really was. It would be a nightmare, I think, for most other people, but for me, I really enjoyed it.
What do you hope people get out of the book when they read it?
Well, that's a good question. I think a couple of things. He was a pioneer. Forensics would not be the same without him, absolutely. And he and his contemporaries just saved lives. They, put people in prison who should have been in prison. They made cops be more accountable, made them kind of take away from, the hunches and the third degree and the guesswork, and using, shoe prints as the main source of evidence. But, Oscar pioneered some really bad science. Bloodstain pattern analysis is completely inaccurate. There are parts of it that are good, but it should never be used as primary evidence. Absolutely. Fingerprinting is another one. We think that fingerprinting for decades was the gold standard. It's not. I mean, all you have to do is go to your DMV and try to do a thumbprint up to the state standard. It took me 5 times to get the right thumbprint for the state to accept my thumbprint. So how do we expect a thumbprint found in a crime scene by a suspect to be up to that same standard, And I think it's just a reminder of how fallible we can be, particularly when we're looking at forensic science that is interpretive, the pattern matching, like the bite mark analysis, the fingerprinting, the shoe prints. Those are things that if you aren't properly trained, or if you're trained differently than another analyst, you might have 2 analysts come up with completely different conclusions. And then we're back to, okay, well, who's right? And how do we know they're right? So it's a cautionary tale. He was amazing. He was a great character. Thank goodness for him, for Oscar Heinrich, and the fact that he was there. And he was so passionate about solving crimes. But we need to take a step back and treat all areas of forensic science as we do like toxicology or DNA. They need to be peer tested, peer reviewed. They need to be constantly tested. They need to be, studied, and for those studies printed in journals. And we just don't do that. These are things that are developed within the law enforcement, outside of the scientific community. We need more federal funding. So I hope that that's clear. And certainly the book does not bash your head, for lack of a less appropriate phrase for this book, over with these subjects, but it's important to know that, just because we have come very far in forensics from Oscar Heinrich's time doesn't mean we don't have much more further to go.
Right. Now, do you have a website or a place that people can come find your blogs or information or anything like that?
Sure. So my website is my name, KateWinklerDawson.com. And on there, you'll see a prompt for a newsletter. I have a podcast that's going to be coming out in the next 6 months or so. And it's the podcast is going to be documentary style, just like my books would be. So one case per season. And so if people are interested, they can, hop on my newsletter and follow it.
Fantastic. A great book. We'll have this linked on our website as well. We're talking about the book American Sherlock, and it's Murder Forensics and the Birth of American CSI, and the author has been our guest, Kate Winkler Dawson. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great stuff, Kate.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end!
I'll see you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.